thing, they'll say, I want to go for ziyarat of Abu Abdullah, I want to go to ziyarat of Karbala. May Allah give us all the ziyarat of Karbala, inshallah. But barring some people in retirement, I haven't ever heard someone say, I want to leave America and go to Karbala and live there. We still like our American passports. We're not really willing to trade those in. But what is it about Microsoft that, or Amazon, or you fill in the blank of the company, Google, Facebook, Meta, whatever, you take your pick, Nvidia, whatever, that can make me get up and move across the country or across the world and leave my family behind, my loved ones behind? So you may not realize it, but these entities, these companies, these corporations, these hospitals, these jobs, they have much more sway over our lives than many other factors. And so what I'm trying to do here is be honest about what is impacting our life. Now, I don't mean that's wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong to move. What I'm saying is economics, finance, other factors, politics even, they impact our lives, whether we're aware of it or whether or not. So now comes this aspect. What's beautiful about Islam is, however, many of our goals that we have, top education, good job, or good business, working for our families and loved ones, supporting them, are not against Islam. In fact, they're supportive of Islam. But sometimes we don't share that with people in a way where they realize that you can have one goal in one life, that is to be a good mu'min of taqwa, but taqwa includes striving for excellence. Taqwa includes working hard for the betterment of society. Taqwa includes all of these things. So now, coming to this, now in our conversation tonight about the future of our community, I want to highlight a few things. The Quranic verses and the principles that we've been implicitly pointing at. Then, what it is about, what the Ahlul Bayt have told us about migration and movements. And then finally, what is the challenge in front of us and what are some solutions that we can start to implement in order to improve the future of our community, not only in the next 5, 10, 15 years, but 50, 75, and 100 years from now, inshallah. This is our agenda for tonight. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. At the first level, the migration and the movement. If you study Islam, you'll find there was movements and there was migrations. There were movements and migrations before Islam. If you read the stories of the prophets, many of the prophets moved from one land to another, one place to another. We recited, for example, some of the verses of Surah Kahf, and we said there were 3 major stories in Surah Kahf. Surah Kahf is also the ayat of Surah Kahf, or also the ayat that Imam Hussein was reciting from the spear after the tragedy of Karbala. أَمْ حَسِبْتَ أَنَّ أَصْحَابَ الْكَهْفِ وَالرَّقِيمِ كَانُوا مِنْ آيَاتِنَا عَجَبًا. And so the story there is of the sleepers of the cave of Ephesus, or also known as Ashab al-Kahf, that is common in the Bible and in the Quran, in Christian belief, in Old Testament, in Christian belief and in Islamic belief. And the principle therein is that there were these few believers who they, not only the believers, but their dog with them as well, who were on a sincere path and Allah preserved them. And so the principle that comes here is that it's not always about numbers. It's not always about majority. It's not always about volume in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you can have quantity with quality, great, that's nurun ala nur. But in the realm of God, at times he's even called Ibrahim an ummah by himself, right? Ibrahim as one individual, Allah called him an ummah. So think about that. Sometimes you need to reinvestigate these things. What's more important, quantity or quality? What if I told you in your work, it's an age-old question, right? Quantity or quality? One of the themes that I want us to take away from this is the same way that we think in other places, you have to sometimes think again and reflect and look at things from different eyes, the same way you may need to look at Islam with different eyes in light of the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. What if I told you that quantity is more important than quality? Well, that would seem to contradict what I just said about the Quran, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. We'll see in a second. In light of what you want to achieve in life, in your career goals, your academic aspirations, and many other things, you may find that quantity is more important than quality. The reference to this is a book that you may have read, which I hope you read. It's called Originals by Adam Grant, UPenn professor. And he said they've done studies on this and they've found when studying Picasso and similar great artists, people often know 1 or 2 works of his, right? You know the Mona Lisa in France? Why is the Mona Lisa famous? I actually went to the Louvre and asked them this question. Like, why is this famous? Why is this artwork famous? They didn't really have a good answer. They said this story and that story, blah, blah, blah. You know what the reason is? It was stolen. It was stolen once, and it was stolen a couple of times, actually. And when it was stolen the first time, do you know that nobody knew it was stolen? For 24 hours, nobody knew. Nobody even realized it. They're like, oh, there should be artwork there. Where'd it go? And then there was a news spectacle that followed the Mona Lisa for 2 years. And every time in the news they said, we still haven't found the Mona Lisa. And eventually they found it. They recovered it. And when they recovered it, everyone flooded to see it. And then from that time, it's just been one person, the other person, and that's why we appreciate it. Because, Da Vinci's done other artworks too. He's done a lot of other stuff that may be much better. What makes this? People say, the eyes follow you. I mean, okay. There's a lot of other technically much better artworks. And so stories can be built around certain things. The reason I'm sharing this with you is some things become famous for reasons that we may not really understand or even know. So now, Grant argues in his book Originals that when it comes to Picasso or Da Vinci or many other people, we just know 1 or 2 or 3 works that are very famous. When in reality, they may have done thousands of works in their life. He talks about Picasso. Picasso, in his whole collection, has thousands of artworks, rugs, carpets, sculptures. You name it, he's done many of them, of which only a few are known. And so the argument that's made is that quantity leads to quality. There's no quality without quantity. I remember NPR, there's a poet, the poet laureate of the US was asked one time, how do you write good poetry? And he said a line, which I think applies to lecturing and life in general. And he says, I believe everyone's a good poet. It's just that we have about 200 bad poems in us that we have to get out of our system. And then the 201st and 202nd and 203rd, this is true for our life. Why do I say this? When it comes to this dynamics of Allah, it's not that just quality is important to Allah. Yes, it is. But Allah gave a huge population an opportunity to be great. But of it, maybe in times only a few people realize that opportunity. There were millions of people living on the earth during the time of the companions of Imam Hussein in Karbala in 61 AH. But only 72 became 72. And that's really what it's about. During the time of Ibrahim, there were many people. But Ibrahim was the only one who Allah said, by yourself, you are an ummah. So now, the first principle of Ashab al-Kahf, quality and quantity, if you can have it with both, fantastic. Otherwise, quality is important to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Second principle is the story of Musa and Khidr. The Quran doesn't say Khidr by name, by the way. The traditions say it, but he met somebody, which our scholar says Khidr. Anyways, the lesson is, which the Quran says, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Above every knower is someone who knows more. We think we may have it all figured out, but we may not necessarily have it all figured out. We need to think again. We need to be humble in our approach. And the third element is Dhul Qarnayn, where you can use power and strength, and like Dhul Qarnayn, as he had a kingdom, to do good for society as much as possible. The same way Sulaiman had this ability. So now, coming to the future of our community and looking at this, I want to share the second main theme of tonight, which is understanding certain things that we need to be cautious of as believers. The narration is that there was a man by the name of Abu Basir who comes to the Imam. They say this is attributed to the 8th Imam, according to some, and some say 6th Imam. The content is the same. The essence is the same. Abu Basir says, he said, Yabna Rasulillah, oh Imam, can you please tell me what are the major sins? What are the canonical sins? Gunai kabira, masiyat kabira, the big ones. That I need to be steer clear of these ones, right? Like the big ones, right? So he says, Abu Basir, note that they are the following. There's 7 of them. He said the first is shirk, to associate anyone with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We already talked about why shirk or association with anyone with Allah is a problem, because it subjugates us, it enslaves us. Allah wants to emancipate us by saying, you're going to prostrate to someone, prostrate to me. But when you prostrate to me, you know that I'm the source of all of the resources of heaven and earth. Yes, there are other means to that end, but ultimately I am the source. So you're worshiping me ultimately. So that was the first principle, this aspect of shirk. Number two, major sin in the court of Allah is to kill any innocent person. The Quran is very clear and categorical on this. Anyone who kills an innocent person, it's as if they've killed all of humanity. And one who saves an innocent person, it's as if they have saved all of humanity. So second principle is that. The third principle of this is to run away from the struggle, from the battlefield, from the struggle of jihad. Now, I remind you and I remind myself that sometimes we have oceans of spirituality within our own religion, and we may be looking at other religions trying to find something. Allow me to explain. Juhad is the root word of jihad, right? Juhad means struggle. Jihad literally means struggle, literally. Mujtahid literally is someone who has struggled to gain knowledge, right? They've struggled to accumulate, to get knowledge. They've gone through difficulties to get knowledge. Now, but there's two types of struggle, right? There's minor and major. Accepted by all Muslims, there's a moment where there are some companions of the Prophet coming back from the battlefield. And when they're coming back from the battlefield, the people are saying, congratulations to you who are coming back from the battlefield, from the struggle. And at that point, there's something that the Prophet says. The Prophet says, congratulations to those who are coming back from the minor struggle towards the major struggle. They said, Ya Rasulullah, what do you mean major and minor struggle? That's the minor struggle? What's the major struggle? I mean, they were putting their lives on the line. What's the major? And to that narration, the narrations say that the Prophet said, that's the minor struggle. The major struggle is the struggle here. The struggle with the nafs, with myself. You know where when you have Jamaat namaz or prayers, where the Imam of the Jamaat, the leader of the Jamaat leads, do you know what that place is called? Mihrab. Mihrab, right? Mihrab comes from harb. Harb means battle. Mihrab literally means battleground. Why is it called battleground? Where am I? Why is the place where I'm praying called a battleground? In fact, that is where their greatest battleground is, the battleground with the self, with myself. So now, I'll share the point with you. The Dalai Lama, the head of Tibetan Buddhism, right? People are very intrigued by, Buddhism, meditation, and many things. And hats off, very good. Islam also has contemplation, tafakkur, and these things. But this is happening on an open forum at Emory University. The Dalai Lama sitting there, a representative of the Christian community, Jewish community, and the Muslim community. Dr. Sayyid Hussain Nasr is sitting next to the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama says, my friends tell me that in Islam, what we hear on the news is not jihad. It's not battle, it's not war, it's not holy war. In fact, the word holy war is nowhere in the Quran. He said, yes. And so Nasr told him the same story about congratulations to those who are coming back to the major jihad from the minor. And he said, if this is the case, that in Islam, the major struggle is the struggle with the self, your spirit, your ruh, your nafs, he said, then all of Tibetan Buddhism is encompassed in the Islamic concept of jihad. What? You have an ocean of spirituality that's been given to you. We just sometimes don't realize it. That ocean of spirituality should enable you to unlock the keys of life. There's nothing that should be impossible for you when you have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there with you, right? So now, he says the third sin, major sin, is to run away from the battlefield. Fourth is to accuse an innocent woman of indecency, right? The Quran says this about Maryam. They did buhtan and azima on her, slander. Sometimes people do ghibat and sometimes they do buhtan. Buhtan's even worse. Slander, or like ghibat, is, it could be true, but you're telling someone else. You should never do that, right? On something that's not allowed in things. But buhtan is another level, that something's not even true. You haven't even verified it, and you're passing it on and saying someone said this. It's a terrible thing to do. And they did this to Maryam alayhi salam, and Allah said, condemn this in the strongest words. So number 4 is to accuse an innocent woman of indecency. Number 5, to disrespect one's parents. I'm not saying this is the Ahlul Bayt, right? To disrespect one's parents. Parents, we talked about the other nights, they are a manifestation or a glimpse of the manifestation of the mercy of Allah on earth. So when we do that, we need to respect them out of respect of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at a bare minimum. Number 6, to steal or usurp the property of an orphan. An orphan who has their parents, their father, their mother has left this world, and they have property that's entitled to them, and you are maybe a trustee or someone, or somehow you steal their property. It's a major sin in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. 7, to deal with riba. We talked about riba the other night, right? And the difference between usury and riba being like loan sharking that puts people in economic servitude, slavery, exorbitant rates. So that was. And then the Imam says the last one is ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah. Ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah, what's that? So now Abu Basir the Imams also had companions at different levels. So the Imam had Abu Basir, and by the question that Abu Basir asks him afterwards, you can tell the level of Abu Basir that he wasn't an average companion, he was elevated. Why? Because he had attention to detail, to the minutiae, to the minute. He said, Yabna Rasulullah, may I ask you a question? These are the major sins? He said, yes. He said, but Yabna Rasulullah, may I ask you another question? He said, yes. He said, at the beginning, you said there's 7, but I counted 8. How's that? And I know you don't make a mistake. There's some wisdom. He said, good observation. He said, for example, shirk, killing an innocent person, running away from the battlefield, accusing an innocent woman of indecency, disrespecting the parents, dealing with stealing orphans' property, riba, and then ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah, 8. He said, you said 7. He said, yes. He said, the reality is, the Imam says, the reality is that shirk and ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah are one and the same. So now, if they are the same, but the Imam differentiated on them, number 1, and number 2, what is it? The differentiation is important. When we believe in Tawheed, Adalat, Nabuwat, technically our scholars say, Adala can technically be a subcomponent of Tawheed. But we separate it for a very particular reason, that Allah will not deal unjustly with us. And His Adala is very important. Technically, Imamat can be under Nabuwat if you know true Nabuwat. But they are differentiated to emphasize the importance. I'll give you an example. Warren Buffett says there are only 2 rules to make money. It may help you in life. And the 2 rules to make money in life are from his teacher, Benjamin Graham, who used to teach at Columbia. And he said the first rule to making money, rule number 1 is don't lose money. It's much harder to make lost money back, right? Percentage-wise. When you have like $100 and you lose 50% on it, you got to make 100% back to get back to where you were, right? He said, number 1 rule is don't lose money. Rule number 2 is refer to rule number 1. There's only 1 rule. And the principle is you emphasize it to realize that you don't want to take advantage of the first principle, which is the most vital principle. Same with this. The Imam is saying that ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah, you may not realize it, but it is the same as shirk. And what is ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah? Ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah, according to our scholars, for example, Sayyid Sistani, may Allah protect him, and others, is to leave a place where you are able to practice your religion and to migrate to a place where you are no longer able to practice your religion in a manner and a way where you are no longer adhering to your wajibat and you are not refraining from your muharramat. Technical, but it's quite simple. You're moving from a place where you were able to do namaz, roza, hajj, zakat, believe in Allah and all of these things, and now you go to a place where it's becoming very, very difficult. That migration is not allowed, except with some caveats. So don't leave. You'll get incomplete information if you leave now. Notice I didn't say going from a Muslim land to a non-Muslim land. You can practice Islam much better in some non-Muslim lands, so to speak, than some Muslim lands today. So it's not about that. So now in this situation, there is a caveat. The caveat is you're allowed to migrate even if there is a threat, even if you may lose your faith, if your life is on the line. But only to the extent that it will save your life. I'll give you a couple of examples. Whatever your political view of him, with all due respect, I'm just sharing an example. He's a scholar, according to many of our scholars, Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini was exiled from Iran, right? Historically, where did he go when he was first exiled? Where did he go? First place? Anyone? Right. So that was a good one. That's one of them. The first place, according to my research, I could be wrong, was Turkey. He first ended up in Turkey. When he was in Turkey, people started hearing about him, and they said there's a Sayyid from, out of town who's in town, and they would flock to him, and he had a spiritual circle being built there. In fact, they banned him from wearing the turban and other clothes. So he used to wear like a trench coat, and you can see pictures of him there. Then eventually he went to, for example, Iraq, very known. He gave his lectures there. And eventually he did end up in Paris, right? When he was in Paris, was he saying, I want to go shopping on Champs-Élysées? Was he saying that I want to go see the Eiffel Tower? Well, I mean, I don't know why you would. We talked about this last night. But he wasn't. He used to live in a little chateau, and he would come out and give a statement to the media. Similarly, our other scholars, you may find, for example, Sayyid Sistani and other scholars, sometimes they have health issues. They have heart issues and other things, and they come to the West for treatment. Like, they'll go to Europe or other places very quietly just to get their treatment done, and they'll go back. They're not like, I need to go and take me around. I need to go shopping. I need to check things out. Take me to Harrods. I need to do some like shopping and stuff like that. They're not interested in that, right? Only migrating to the level that is necessary. I'll give you an example that's closer to home. Harvard's a pretty good school. It's okay, right? MIT's not bad. BU, I hear, is expensive. It's pretty good too, I imagine, right? What if I told you they have some amazing classes that happen in these institutions? And you can add in all the institutions that you want. Babson, Bentley, you go down Wellesley, go down the line. But what if I told you that people go there for education? But what if I told you in and around the universities and the colleges, sometimes not the best things are happening? What if I told you people get together and do things that probably aren't the main reason someone should be at college or university? Would you believe me or not? Similarly, there are side effects. Similarly, when you move somewhere, you may have moved for work or life or something else, but other things may impact you, whether you realize it or not, for better or for worse. Why our scholars say is that ta'arrub ba'd al-hijra is tantamount to shirk. To leave a place and migrate in a way where you've left your religion is tantamount to shirk, is because shirk is not only idols and idol worship that you physically have. If you recall the line of poetry we said a couple of nights ago, ye daur apne barahim ki talash mein hai, sanam kada hai, jahan la ilaha illallah. That this era is looking for its Ibrahim who destroyed the idols. It's looking for him. The whole world is that. So the scholars say it's possible that we may have the idol of wealth. We may have the idol of dignity. We may have the idol of becoming a prestigious person. We may have an idol of X, Y, and Z. And somehow we thought that was more important than the faith of God, the religion of God. And if that's the case, then whether we realize it or not, we've put something over the other. Now, again, we're not done yet. It's complex. So there's a solution to this given to us by the Imams themselves. The third level. Imam had a companion by the name of Hammad. The sixth Imam had a companion by the name of Hammad al-Sindhi. He was from Sindh. Hammad al-Sindhi was a businessman or a trader. He used to travel all over. And he was a merchant, and he used to go to different places. And one of the places he used to go was Byzantium. He used to go to the Roman Empire. And when he used to go to the Roman Empire, and he would come back to Medina, people used to taunt him and pass jokes and make fun of him. And they would say, Hammad, you go so much to those non-Muslim lands that one day you're going to die. And one day you may die over there. And if you die over there, you're going to be raised amongst the non-Muslims. So he says, Yabna Rasulullah, he says to the Imam, I'm not as worried about what they say. I'm actually more concerned about what you think. So what is it? What's the case? Is it what they say is true, or I have nothing to worry about? The Imam, wisdom of course, he said, Hammad, before I answer your question, answer a question for me. You have to categorize things, right? He says, Hammad, when you go out of town in Byzantium, for example, for business or otherwise, do you tell people about us? Do you tell people about the Ahlul Bayt? Do you tell them about the Quran? Do you tell them about Islam? Do you tell them about Allah? He said, yes, I do, Ya Ibn Rasulullah. He said, what about when you're in Medina, when you're back home? Do you tell people about Islam and the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt and invite them to good, you know, Amr bil Ma'ruf, Nahi anil Munkar, and these things? Do you do that? He said, no. Perhaps he didn't feel the need. Maybe people are already Muslim. Maybe people feel like they're holier than thou. They have everything figured out. He said, no. He said, then very well. He said, Hamad, if that's the case, and if you go for business in Byzantium and you die there, raising this banner and raising the flag and raising awareness about our affairs and the Islam and the Quran, then Allah will raise you by yourself on the day of judgment as an ummah by yourself. And there will be nur in front of you. The principle that the Imam lays out is, if we go to another part of the world and we are raising the principles of good, the principles of justice, the principles of the Quran, the principles of the Ahlul Bayt, the principles of truth, that's good. By the way, if you read the letter of Imam Ali to Malik, you don't always explicitly have to say, this is what the Quran says, therefore all of society should do this. In the letter to Malik, Imam Ali does not reference any ayat of the Quran. Implicitly, yes, maybe. But explicitly, no. Because he said he's ruling over a very diverse community that's not even predominantly Muslim, it's predominantly Christian. Similarly, there are people in our world, in our society, who may be craving the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. And you know, there are communities that do this. You ever read that book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? What if I told you that was a secularized form of Mormon principles? The Latter-day Saints, you remember Mitt Romney, or governor? Yeah. So they shared that with the world, and they felt that that was something that should be shared with the world in a secular manner, and it was. Covey was of that community. And so, there are teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, which my friends who have converted or reverted to the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, they themselves are saying that if people knew, it would be something. And we have a lot of work to do there, and we can do it. What's beautiful about this is that at a moment, you may be in a situation, we may be in a situation where we may be guilty of ta'arub ba'd al-hijrah, but at a moment, you can correct your sail. It just takes a moment. You don't have to get up and leave. By the way, please don't infer that I'm suggesting in any way that the solution is to pack up and leave. Where are you going to go? Where am I going to go? This is a home. I mean, I wouldn't be able to adjust anywhere else. We may not be able to, this is a home. I'm not saying go anywhere. What I'm saying is, we have to understand the parameters and the dynamics of what is necessary. So now, having said this, you may be able to practice more religion in Islam here than any other part of the world. And you'll find more freedom, right? This same United States is where I told you the other nights that Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Today, if you go to the Supreme Court of the United States of America in DC, you'll see artwork on the wall. And amongst the artwork, one of the artwork is stonework of some of the greatest lawgivers in the history of humanity. And in that, etched in the stone, you'll find the likes of Hammurabi and Hammurabi's code. You'll find the likes of Moses and the 10 Commandments. Until this day, you'll find etched into the stone of the Supreme Court of the United States an image of an individual who is stated to be none other than Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? As one of the greatest lawgivers in history. And you find that, in fact, CARE wanted it removed. They asked the Supreme Court to remove it several years ago, about 20 years ago, and they said, we don't make images of the Prophet out of respect of him. And the Supreme Court said, thanks, but no thanks. I think we'll keep it. And the principle being here that this country gives us liberties. Yes, we may have lost our compass in certain areas, definitely. And we should be able to criticize where criticism is due. But at the same time, the freedoms, the liberties, are those things which the Ahlul Bayt echoed, which they were inspiring people to. So now, having said this, I'm coming to the third level and a very important element and the take-home message of tonight, which is the following. If that is the case, what is our future looking like in front of us? And remember, Imam Ali said, learn from history. The Quran teaches us, learn from history. Islam, the Quran tells us the story of the prophets. It tells us the story of Adam, of Nuh. It tells us about the struggle of Nuh. It tells us about different nations that came before, for example. Qawm Lut, for example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about people who came in this era, in this time, in this prophet, and that prophet. All for us to learn from those lessons. So now, what's a lesson that the Quran gives us and Ahlul Bayt teach us? Imam Ali, again, Nahj al-Balagha, letter 31 to his son, he said, learn from history, right? And perhaps some of the greatest historians, whether it was Toynbee or Durant or Huxley, they said that one of the biggest lessons of history is simple. And the biggest lesson of history is that man does not learn from history. We don't learn. You know, they asked Durant. Durant wrote The Story of Civilization, right? Musk, every titan of industry of our time has read this book, right? This series of books. And they asked him, what's the relationship? You studied the history of humanity, and there's a condensed version called The Lessons of History, which Ray Dalio says is his favorite book, and it summarized a lot of it. But they asked him, Durant, after studying all of human history, what is it that is the relationship between human beings and religion in the history of humanity? He said, you want to know the history, the relationship between history and religion throughout times? He said, I'll tell you in one line. What history tells us about the relationship between history and religion and humanity is the following. When times are bad, religiosity goes up. And when times are good, religiosity goes down. Doesn't the Quran tell us this? When they're in the midst of the waves in the ocean, they're about to drown, and there's no one there, they call out to Allah, Ya Allah, help me. And Allah delivers them, and God delivers them. And as soon as they touch land, they forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the world that we're going through and we're living through. You'll find studies from institutions such as Notre Dame and other universities have looked at religion and society today. And they've looked at religion and the younger generation in our society, younger generation being 35, like millennials and younger and the likes. And they found that the form of religion that is followed amongst not non-practicing but practicing people of faith, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others, in America, the God that is followed, the form of religion that is followed, is very different than was followed before. Some of the takeaways of the study, you can check this out on your own. Over 2,000 people were studied. It was a sizable study. And they found that, number one, they believe in a God who's there when they need him. But when they don't need him, he's on the periphery. A therapeutic God, right? A God that when I need him, he's there. When I don't need him, I'm okay. Another form that is different from their parents. And another form of God or religion that they believe in is one of, of good as opposed to bad. These are positive things. But they said the form of God that is followed by younger Americans today is a form that the researchers called moralistic therapeutic deism. Moralistic therapeutic deism. So it was a God of good, a better, morality. It was a therapeutic God that helps us in difficult times. And he was a deity. I believe in him deistically versus not deistically. But the principle is very different than the belief than others before. I say this because understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the central notion of your power and your essence of what you're able to accomplish in life is very important to understand. The Ahlul Bayt gave their lives for people to understand Tawheed and Allah, God Almighty, ultimately. That's how important it is. So now, bringing all of these pieces of the puzzle together, when you look at this, we need to understand what people are going through. What are the challenges? What are the things that are facing? And sometimes we may not recognize things. I gave you the example of Matam and yesterday and the basis of it. I'll give you another example tonight that you may not realize. Some people don't understand weeping, crying for Imam Hussein and the Ahlul Bayt. I'll share something with you. Don't have to accept it. I'm just sharing perspective with you. I shared this, and a brother, I'll never forget, I was in New York at the time, and a brother who was at Columbia, a student at Columbia, he came up to me and he said, I'll never forget that line. It just opened eyes. And you'll find that when a child is born, and he comes into this world, one of the first things that the healthcare professionals are looking for is for the child to cry, to weep. If the child's not, they'll try to figure out how why not and make it happen. Because tears, crying is a sign of life, not death. When we cry, perhaps our world needs to weep more. If it did weep more, perhaps we wouldn't be killing innocent children in the middle of the Middle East. Perhaps we wouldn't have a situation where people can be killed in broad daylight and nothing happens. We have, in some sense, as a collective, we've lost our humanity. As a collective, we've lost our humanity. And that's a concern. But there's another angle that you may want to consider. And I'll never forget this. Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr mentions this. And he gives a talk on Imam Hussein in Karbala in London. And he said something interesting, which I want you to never forget. He said, if nothing else, with respect to Imam Hussein alayhi salam and Karbala and the movement, the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, the followers of Imam Hussein, I should say, because there's no camp. Imam Hussein doesn't belong to me or you. Ye kisne keh diya ke hamari hai Karbala? Ye kisne keh diya ke hamari hai Karbala? Haq baat tum kaho to tumhari hai Karbala. So who said Karbala is mine or yours? Karbala, whoever speaks truth, it's for those people. And so now, on this junction and this notion of a situation where you and I are dealing with Karbala and this movement of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, where do we stand on this? Where do we find ourselves on this? Are we just going to go with the drift? So the second element that Dr. Nasr says is, if nothing else, the followers of the Ahlul Bayt should prostrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in thanks every day, every year, every week for the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, that are saved in therapy costs a year because of the zikr of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. And I mentioned this and perhaps I didn't understand the depth until someone came to me after a lecture and they said, Sayyid, I want to share something with you that maybe you can share with others. So what is it? He said, my nephew, his parents had died and he fell into a shock where he wouldn't speak. He wouldn't do anything. His whole personality had crumbled. He was completely aloof. He was absolutely devastated. And so we took him to the best physicians, we took him to the best psychiatrists, the best experts, and they said, you have to get him to vent. You have to get him to express his emotion somehow. He can't keep it built up inside. It may explode like a pressure cooker. It may come out on the other end and do something that's not good. You need him to vent. So now they were in a situation where they didn't know how to get him to vent. How do you get him to vent? He's not communicating with him. He's completely silent, completely stoic in some sense. Until they said, perhaps, it was the Muharram time, they said, perhaps we can take him to the Majlis of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. So they were able to get him to go to the Majlis on the 8th of Muharram, on the night of Abu Fadl Abbas. And he said that night, he was able to let out all of his tears. And it was as if he came alive once again. You don't know this, I don't know this, but in our crowds, people listening across the globe, people in majalis, every corner of the world is having majalis of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. In that crowd, there's a mother who has lost her son. And she doesn't have an avenue to vent except for the Karbala narrations, except for Ali Akbar. There is a mother who has lost a 6-month-old child or less, a stillborn child, or a child who may be a couple of years old. And it is in the story of Ali Asghar that they find solace. The generosity of the Ahlul Bayt is such that through their zikr, they help put ointment on our wounds. So now, you may not know, there's a divine wisdom that Allah has instilled for us to recognize in these things. It seems that when we go through difficulty, and then we see the difficulty of Imam Hussein, it puts everything in perspective. There's a miracle therein. So now, the take-home message. What do we learn from history? I want you to never forget this book. It's called Religion and Immigration. It's edited by Dr. John Esposito, Professor Emeritus at Georgetown University. And it's written by several professors and rabbis and others, different chapters in it. There's a chapter in it that is on the community, the experience of the Jewish community in America over decades and centuries. And the book argues something, and I want you to maybe look at some possible parallels. And the book says in 1650, the first generation of immigrants came on the shores of America from abroad, it happened that the management and the leadership of the Dutch West India Company, you know the Dutch West India Company, there was a Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company. These were massive institutions of the time. The management in Brazil wrote a letter to a man who was a governor of a particular place, the governor of New Amsterdam. They wrote a letter. From Brazil, they wrote a letter to the governor of New Amsterdam. His name was Peter Stuyvesant. Today we call it New Amsterdam, we call it New York. Right? At that time it was called New Amsterdam. And so they write a letter and they say, we want to relocate about 20 of our community members from Brazil to your state or your region of New Amsterdam. And as you know, Stuyvesant was known to be a bigot, to say the least, and a lot of things. And he said, I can't take these people. Why? Because who's going to take care of them if they need something? Who's going to take care of them if they need money or health care or whatever? They wrote a one-line response back and they said, you have nothing to worry about. They will be taken care of by their own. This was a community of Jewish immigrants. But despite all of that effort, the historians say, and you can check the book on this, 1650 is when people moved the first wave of Jewish immigrants to America. But 100 years later, in the tri-state area of America, there was not a single person who identified as Jewish. They all had intermarried or they all had assimilated in some way. And they lost their Jewish identity. Fast forward 200 years, 1850s, right before the Civil War, this was the era of the second wave of Jewish immigrants to America. And historians document that the second wave of Jewish immigrants to America, they heard and they knew and they had studied the mistakes or the lack of adaptation that the first generation had done. And they said, we're not going to make the same mistakes as our predecessors made. We're going to do something else. We're going to bring our top intellectuals. We're going to bring our poets. We're going to bring our intelligentsia. We're going to bring the cream of our crop from Europe and all over the world to America with us. And we're going to create communities, much like the communities that were created in Brooklyn and Chicago and other parts of America. And so they did that. And when they did that, historians document that despite all their efforts, the first generation of the second wave of Jews who came in 1850, the first generation of the second wave of Jews were considered Orthodox, original. The second generation of Jewish immigrants of the second wave, right on the turn of the century, the second generation were people who were considered conservative. So they were still practicing, but not as much as their predecessors, their parents. The third generations, the researchers said, they were Reformed Jews, right? So they had a different total perspective on many things. And this is where this is more cultural in some sense. And the fourth generation, the last generation, which is what the researchers called de-Judaized. They're no longer Jewish. The Jewish community in America used to do something every 10 years. They stopped doing it because the results were very clear. It was called the NJPS, the National Jewish Population Survey. And they would ask people, for example, like, how are you Jewish? What makes you Jewish? How important is your identity to you? And things of that nature. And they found more clearly that by far and away people were saying that were you religiously Jewish, culturally Jewish, or both? By far and away everyone was saying we're culturally Jewish, we're not religiously, or both. But it doesn't stop there. The lesson I also want us to learn is the second generation of the second wave of immigrants, they built on the businesses of their parents and they became very affluent, very wealthy. And they started building synagogues that were magnificent. They were majestic. I've seen some of these in New York and I've seen some of these in Beverly Hills. Some of them in Beverly Hills, it looks like it's like a garden in Jannah, literally, like that's what you would imagine, how much money has been spent on some of these. And in Miami and other places. But after they built these massive synagogues where they brought artwork from all over the world, and they brought doors and wood and material from all over the world, and art and all the bells and whistles, the second generation, when it was going into the third generation, and they had gotten elderly and they were about to leave the world, they had a saying for these synagogues that they built. Do you know what that was? The saying was that these synagogues that we've put money, time, effort, everything into, he said these synagogues, the generation said, these synagogues are heavy on sweat and light on tears. Ooh. Heavy on sweat, light on tears, what? That means we put so much time, so much effort, so much money, but there's no one here on the Sabbath. There's no one here to worship. There's no spirituality. It's empty, it's devoid. And I put my hand on my heart and I tell you, from east to west, this is what the Muslim community is doing today. I don't say this to say that don't do and don't build. What I'm saying is recognize the challenges. So where you're going to build physical infrastructure, make sure you don't neglect spiritual infrastructure. Physical infrastructure without spiritual infrastructure may not get you very far. And so now we have work cut out for us. Do you know what sociologists say about Islam? They say that with the post 9/11 world, it may not take 4 generations, it may take 3, maybe less. And you may find that that's already happening. If you go to work or school, you may find that people say, you know, what's your religion? Typically, you don't talk about religion and politics at work, right? But let's say you have the conversation with a friend. Say, what's your religion? They say, I don't know. They say, I was born Protestant. I was born Catholic. I was born Presbyterian. I was born, you fill in the blank. I was born Jewish. I was born Christian. I was born XYZ. What does that mean? What are they saying? I'm not. My parents were, right? Believe me, you'll find that people today are saying, I was born Muslim. And I don't fault them. I'm not here to point a finger and say anything bad to them at all. In fact, I'm just saying that maybe they had their own journey, or maybe we didn't serve them as a community, or we didn't meet their needs. Gone are the days of one-size-fits-all majalis. Before, we used to have differences based on language. Today, with people's concentration of time, we may need to have different parallel programs on different topics, on different issues, based on the challenges and themes of different ages, demographics, and community members. Sometimes I need to hear about Khandaq and Khaybar. I need it for my spirituality. I need it for my iman. I need it for the audacity and the courage. Believe me, there's a power in the spirit of the Ahlul Bayt that can make you move mountains. But sometimes I also need to know how to treat my spouse and my children and deal with the challenges of life. And sometimes the same person needs something in the morning and something in the evening. How, from a speaker's perspective, I'm telling you here, how is one to cater to so many demographics in a one-size-fits-all environment? It's next to impossible. You know, communities have ratings for Maulanas, right? Between me and you, Maulanas also have ratings for communities. And you probably don't want to know all of them. And the reality of the matter is, there are certain aspects that we need to be cognizant and very real about. I'm inviting you, the take-home message is this: take ownership, take action. If that means doing small programs at your home with a few friends as supplemental, fantastic. If that means having a space where the leadership gives you the space, doing it there in addition, fantastic. If that means doing it at the university, fantastic. But that needs to come together, where all of us come together and say, this is something that we need to work on in order to uplift our community. Otherwise, the writing is on the wall. The writing's on the wall. Many people in our community, many of our communities, we buy churches, don't we? You go across America, many imam baras are former churches. Why? Because people left, people moved, and there's the elder generation retired, and there's nobody to take care of anymore. You don't think that may happen to us? I'll give you one study that will bring this home. Sometimes we think that things may impact others, they may not impact us. But as the poet says, Dil ke khush rakhne ko ghalib ye khayal acha hai. Just to keep your heart satisfied and happy, it's a nice thought, but may not be in reality. Have you heard of illusory superiority? Illusory? superiority. They did studies in Europe and in America, and they asked people in these studies, how many of you think that you are better than the average driver? How many of you think that you're better than the average driver? How many of you think you're better than the average? Any hands? Okay. They did these in Europe and they did Scandinavian countries and in America. What numbers do you think they got? You think half, right? Yeah, so they found in Europe, 77% of drivers thought they were better than the average. And in America, 88% of drivers thought they were better than average. What's the problem with that? If you've taken your elementary stats classes, it's above average, 50-50. That means that if you do your math, 77 minus 50, 27 in Europe, and about 38% in America are overestimating their ability. They're either below average or at average. They're not above average. And we sometimes think that we're immune, when in reality, if we implement the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt as they taught it, then we can be immune, yes. But if we're not implementing it the appropriate way, then we have work to do. Imam Hussein gave everything. Imam Hussein loved his family. But he loved one thing more, even more. And that was God. That was Iman. That was Islam. You know the ocean of spirituality that is Karbala? The ocean of love? There's a poet who says a line, John, the absolute manifestation of the love of Allah. Ye to bas sar hi mangta hai miyan. Ye to bas sar hi mangta hai miyan. Ishq par Karbala ka saya hai. Divine love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You better come with your A game. Because Imam Hussein alayhi salam showed what true love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. He gave everything. Divine love is that. But Imam Hussein empowers us. Another final question. These things are things you may never hear. And I don't know when the next time is I'll be here. My constraints are my constraints, your constraints are your constraints. A group of us young speakers went to meet Ayatollah, many of the scholars in Najaf, to get guidance for our community when we go back to speak. And one of the scholars we got guidance from was Sayyid Ja'far al-Hakim, from the very famous al-Hakim family. And he asked a question that I'll never forget. There was a bunch of us sitting there who were lecturers or speakers, younger guys. And he said, we were in a state where we were speaking, we were in a state and an environment where we were facing persecution of Saddam and other things during the Ba'athist regime in Iraq. And they spent time in jail unjustly. And they were tortured. Some of them were electrocuted. Their nails were pulled. Things I can't speak of. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly says in the Quran in Surah Baqarah, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Most surely, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّ means absolutely guaranteed. Take it to the bank. You will be tested. How? وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ with fear. Jew, hunger, naqsim min al-amwal, loss of wealth, wal anfus, your life, yourself, wal thamarat, your fruits, that could be your children, that could be your most valuable assets. You'll be tested. There's no escaping tests. But the tests are not to demoralize you, they're to lift you higher. As Iqbal says, it's the winds come and the gust comes to make the Shaheen or the Falcon not go lower, but to fly higher. This happens when you fly, right? In an airplane, sometimes a pilot will say, we got to go higher altitudes. Why? These altitudes have turbulence. Similarly, you may find that sometimes Allah gives us challenges to raise us. And we look back and we say, I didn't know I had that in me. So now, in this environment, these challenges that will come. So he asked the question. This was what Sayyid Ja'far said. He said, look, we went hungry, we were imprisoned, we used to go through struggle after struggle. This was our test for Islam. This was our test for Islam. And he looked at us and he said, what is your test for Islam? You heard of problems? Have you heard of first world problems? We have first world problems. My charger is out of battery, my phone is out of battery, the charger cable is too long. I go to my coffee shop, they're out of my favorite drink, my day's over. There are people who are struggling to get clean water to drink. There's people who are struggling to survive today. Overseas and even sometimes in our neighborhoods, there are people who are struggling to afford medicines, to afford food, to afford some basic things sometimes. I ask you the question that someone who's a follower of the Ahlul Bayt living in Afghanistan or Pakistan or India, or you fill in the blank, in Iraq or Yemen or somewhere, and you and I, and we get in front of Allah and God on the day of judgment, and God says, you go into heaven, you go into heaven. And you go to the same level. That person who struggled, who saw their family butchered, who saw poverty, who saw difficulty, does that person not have a claim, or at least the ability to ask God on the day of judgment, Ya Allah, you told me you are Adil, I believed you. But this person's life and my life were not the same. I had to see bloodshed, I had to see difficulty, I had to see warfare, I had to see poverty, I had to see lifelessness, I had to see struggle, I had to see imprisonment unjustly. And that person came in an S-class, that person came in a X, Y, and Z, that person lived on High Street. How is that fair? And you go into the same Jannah? You go in the same paradise? Everyone has to answer that themselves, but nobody had an answer for him. I just shared one perspective, and I said respectfully to Sayyid, and he appreciated this. I said, you know, it may be, may Allah reward you, and there's no doubt how much the Al-Hakim family has sacrificed, if you know their history. Anyways, I said, it may be that living in that part of the world, our test is not physical. It may be that our test is psychological, intellectual. Our test may not be to give blood. Our test may be something else. Our test may be when people are looking down on our religion, to stand up and speak for our religion, tell the truth about it. When people hear misinformation about our religion, to not crumble, to stand tall and say, I believe this for X, Y, and Z reason. This is what the prophets believed, what Isa believed and others believed. There's no easy domain here. But there's value and it's worthwhile. The test of Karbala shows us toil and excellence. And if you tap into that, you'll be able to do the impossible. मुझको दुनिया में मसाइब मुझको दुनिया में कोई शख्स भी ऐसा न मिला मुझको दुनिया में कोई शख्स भी ऐसा न मिला जो ये कह सकता हो शब्बीर से मांगा न मिला जो ये कह सकता हो शब्बीर से मांगा न मिला और एक बार सखावत के मुताबिक मांगे एक बार उनकी सखावत के मुताबिक मांगे ऐसा मौला को कोई मांगने वाला न मिला ऐसा मौला को कोई मांगने वाला न मिला और कम से कम जान है कीमत ये समझ कर आना कम से कम जान है कीमत ये समझ कर आना इश्क शब्बीर किसी को कभी सस्ता न मिला इश्क शब्बीर किसी को कभी सस्ता. The love of Imam Hussein never went on sale, it never went cheap. It's something that is valuable, but that value makes the world a better place. Ajrukum ala Allah. Tonight we take our hearts, it's Shab Ashur. There's no words for these nights. Just take your hearts to Karbala, to be with Imam Hussein, to be with the Ahlul Bayt. The narrations say that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam on Yawm Ashura, he brought his child in front of the enemy. Before that, there came a moment where Imam Hussein calls out, after all of the companions have gone, he calls out on the plains of Karbala. He says, Ala hal min nasir yansurna, hal min ghith yughithuna, hal min dhab yadhabbu an haram Rasulillah, hal min nasir yansurna. Is there anyone to come to our assistance? Is there anyone to come to our aid? Is there anyone to look after the women and children of Rasulullah? He cried out. When he cried this out on the plains of Karbala, the narrations say there was a cry that came from the tents of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Imam Hussein comes back to the tents. He says that I am alive. What is the meaning of this weeping and crying while I am alive? They said, Mawla, they said Imam al-Hussein, they said that there was a madlumiyat, there was an oppression, and there was something in your voice about your cry, Hal min Nasir yansurna, that the 6-month-old child, Aliun al-Asghar, he threw himself from the cradle. He fell from the cradle. And we began to weep when we saw this state. At that junction, Imam Hussein says, give the child to me. Perhaps I can take the child. And perhaps I can get some water for the child. The narration say, Imam says, call on for me. Rabab, the mother of Ali Asghar. A mother comes with a 6-month-old child in her hands. And she brings Ali al-Asghar, thinking that perhaps the Imam can go and get some water for the 6-month-old. Imam al-Hussein takes his son into his hands. He covers Ali al-Asghar, the 6-month-old child, who when he left from Medina, when the family left from Medina, he was only but 2 weeks old. Now by the time they have reached Karbala, he is 6 months. At that moment, Imam Hussein, he covers his child with a cloth. Why? Because the sun is blazing on the plains of Karbala, and the child has been deprived of water and the milk of its mother. Ajrukum ala Allah. At that point, they say Imam Hussein proceeded towards the ashqiya, towards the opposition, towards the enemy. When he went, he took this child in his arms, covered with the cloth. At that point, from the distance, they thought that Imam Hussein was bringing the Quran so that perhaps he would end the war. But when Imam Hussein got there in front of the army of Yazid, what did he say? He calls out to the army of Yazid and he says, O army of Umar ibn Sa'ad, O army of Sham, and wherever you have come from, perhaps in your eyes I am guilty, perhaps in your eyes I have done something wrong, but I ask you, this child, as the Imam removes the cloth, this 6-month-old child, what has he done? What is his sin? What is it that he is guilty of? His mother's milk has gone dry. If there's anything that you can do, perhaps you can give this child water so that he may remain in this world. At that point, ajrukum ala Allah, when this happened and they saw this state in that environment, they say within the army of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, even some people began to say that we didn't know there were children this small in the camps of Hussein. There was a turbulence occurring that perhaps they thought, that Umar ibn Sa'ad thought that perhaps they will turn on him. At that point, they give the orders and they say to Hurmala bin Kahil, Iqta kalam al-Hussein. Imam Hussein cut off the words of Hussein. Why? Imam Hussein even went to the extent that he said, if you think that I will drink water in place of this child, then here, I'll put the child on the ground. You give him water yourself. I'll take him back. I won't touch the water. Imam Hussein puts his child on the ground, and at that moment there is no response. May Allah never show any father the day that they ask for anything for their child, and that too water, and it is not given. Imam Hussein, he takes Ali Asghar in his hands. He says, Ali Asghar, perhaps there is no one to respond to you. Perhaps there is no one to respond to us. On the other side, they say, Iqta kalam al-Hussein, cut off the words of Hussein. The arrow leaves the hands of Hurmala, and when it leaves, the narrations say it goes towards Hussein, in whose arms is Ali Asghar, a 6-month-old. You and I are faced with this devastating blow. At that point, when the arrow comes, the narrations say it strikes Ali Asghar. And in what state? The narrations say, min al-uzni ila al-uzn, that the arrow went from one ear to the other. It was as if Ali Asghar flapped his hands like a bird flaps its wings in the hands of Abu Abdullah al-Husayn. Ya Allah, ajrukum ala Allah. This is not the final nights. This is it. After that, who knows who will have next year? They say Imam Hussein saw his child in his hands, the blood in his hands. Imam Hussein wanted to take the blood of Ali Asghar. He wanted to throw it towards the heavens. They say the angels descend and say, Imam al Hussein, if you throw this innocent blood towards the sky, perhaps there will be no rain that will ever descend on the ground. Imam Hussein wanted to throw the blood towards the ground, and perhaps at that moment they said, Ya Ibn Rasulillah, O Imam al-Hussein, if you do this, there will be no grain that will ever come out of the ground. This is the purest of blood which has been shed in the most devastating way. Imam Hussein takes the blood of Ali Asghar, he puts it on his face, he puts it on his beard, he says, bear witness that I will meet my grandfather Rasulullah in this state. The poet says, Inkar asma ko hai, razi zameen nahi, asghar tere lahu ka ठिकाना kahin nahi. The skies would not accept, the ground would not accept. Ali Asghar is coming back with Imam Hussein, but the test is not done. Ajrukum ala Allah. Imam Hussein, how does he tell a mother? How does he tell a mother that her 6-month-old child has left this world? Imam Hussein steps forward, and it's as if he steps back, and eventually he gets towards the khayma, he gets towards the tent. When he gets towards the tents, they say Imam Hussein has covered the child, and he calls out into the tent, Rabab, come and take your amana, come and take your trust. He says to a mother, this mother may have thought that her child had just come back from getting water from the battlefield. Rabab comes to the door of the khayma, to the door of the tent. What does she see? Imam Hussein removes the cloth of Ali Asghar. Rabab sees it. She says one line. She said, my master, my Mawla, they don't even kill animals, that's what. They don't even kill animals. That's small. Ajrukum ala Allah. But the test of Imam Hussein is not done. The narrations say that Imam al-Hussein had to bury this 6-month-old with his own hands. May Allah never show anyone this day. Imam Hussein went to the back of the khayma. He took his sword and the sheath of the sword, and he began to dig a grave. Allah knows how he did this. Because the sand was warm and very hot, and Hussein alayhi salam had one hand for the digging of the grave. Perhaps he pressed his child to his chest and he dug the grave of Ali Asghar. Allah knows how Imam Hussein did it, but perhaps even more difficult and more devastating was when Imam al-Hussein put his child into the grave, and then he had to put sand on the face of Ali al-Asghar. This one who was the light of the Ahlul Bayt. As the poet said, what happened in a moment? Ye durre najaf hai, abhi yaqut banega. Ye durre najaf hai, abhi yaqut banega. Jis jhule mein jhula hai, wo taabut banega. The child, his own cradle has become his grave. Imam Hussein buries his son. Only Allah knows how he was able to do this. Ajrukum ala Allah. Azadaro maine khatam kiya. Shab Ashur hai. Jab Shab Ashur hui aur phir Sham Gharib aayi. Ashqiya ne kaha कि जितने भी सारे शुहदा हैं उनके लिए इनाम दिया जाएगा. तमाम सर इकट्ठे किए गए, एक सर नहीं मिल रहा था. अशकिया ने कहा कि हमने देखा हुसैन ने अपने 6 माह को, अपने 6 माह के बेटे को पुश्ते खैमा पर दफन किया था. पिसर साद ने कहा, इब्न जियाद ने कहा कि मैं इनाम दूंगा जो भी सर ले आए. तारीख یہ کہتی ہے کہ کربلا میں اشقیاء اور یزید کے لوگ اپنے نیزے زمین کربلا میں گاڑنے لگے. ایک ماں در خیمہ پہ تھی کہ بار الہ میرے بچے کی خیر ہو. آخری جملہ، بیوی نے سب کچھ دیا. شاعر نے عجیب شعر کہا، کربلا سے جو کبھی ہو کے ہوا آتی ہے، کسی معصوم کی ہچکی کی صدا آتی ہے، اور ہاں دھڑکتا نہ ہو مرقد میں کہیں قلب رباب، ہاں دھڑکتا نہ ہو مرقد میں کہیں قلب رباب، علی اصغر کی صدا آتی ہے. صلی اللہ علیہ یا رسول اللہ، صلی اللہ علیہ یا امیر المؤمنین، صلی اللہ علیہ یا فاطمة الزہراء سیدۃ النساء العالمین، صلی اللہ علیہ یا حسن المجتبى. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. ماتم حسين 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 حسين.
یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین
توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں. کربلا والے مسافر کو، کربلا والے مسافر کو سنبھالو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں. ابھی کچھ دیر ٹوٹ ہے رو میرا پتتا ہے جگر، پاس تم بھی میرے نانا کی چلے جانا مگر، آخری بار کلیجے سے، آخری بار کلیجے سے لگا لو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں. بن تمہارے نہیں منظور یہ جینا مجھ کو، راس آئے گا کہاں بھی ہے مدینہ مجھ کو، لے چلو ساتھ کفن میں ہے چھپا لو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، توڑ کر بند کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں. جب سے مارا ہے ستم گر نے تماشا تم کو، آنکھ بڑھ کر نہیں شابر نے دیکھا تم کو، ایک نظر روتے ہوئے بیٹے پہ ڈالو اماں، توڑ کر بندے کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، توڑ کر بندے کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، توڑ کر بندے کفن مجھ کو بلا لو اماں، دل نہیں مانتا کسے تنہائی برداشت کرو، دیکھ کر آپ کے قاتل کو میں خاموش رہو، اس اذیت سے کسی طرح، اس اذیت سے کسی طرح نکالو اماں، چھوڑ کر بندے
کفن مجھ کو یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین. آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر، جھولا تیرا جھولاواں، جھولا تیرا جھولاواں، کیوں رس گیا ہے ماں تو، آجا میں باری جاواں، آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر، جھولا تیرا جھولاواں، کیوں رس گیا ہے ماں تو، آجا میں باری جاواں، آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر. آ میرا نازنین ڈاڈی گرم زمین، آ میرا نازنین ڈاڈی گرم زمین، آجا میں جولی پا کے، آجا میں جولی پا کے، والاں دی چاں بناواں، آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر، جھولا تیرا جھولاواں، کیوں رس گیا ہے ماں تو، آجا میں باری جاواں، آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر. اصغر محرم موڑی سنگت نمادی توڑی، اصغر محرم موڑی سنگت نمادی توڑی، جولی چولال دے کے، جولی چولال دے کے، سکھی سوندیاں نے ماواں، آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر، جھولا تیرا جھولاواں، کیوں رس گیا ہے ماں تو، آجا میں باری جاواں، آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر. امڑی نارج کے چایا، بہنی نارج کھڑایا، امری نارج کے چایا، بہنی نارج کھڑایا، آجا میں تینوں پڑھ کے، آجا میں تینوں پڑھ کے، صبرا دا خط سناواں، آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر، جھولا تیرا جھولاواں، کیوں رس گیا ہے ماں تو، آجا میں باری جاواں، آجا بلال اصغر، آجا بلال اصغر. یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین، اور محمد وآل محمد صلوات.
السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين، خصوصا سيدي ومولاي أبي الفضل العباس بن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا تسة المعصومين من ذرية الحسين ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك غريب الغرباء، السلام عليك معين الضعفاء والفقراء، السلام عليك شمس الشموس وانيس النفوس، أيها المدفون بأرض طوس الراضي بالقدر والقضاء ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا صاحب الأس والزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان، أجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله مخرجك وزهورك ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك توعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل